Welcome back to Education in Context, a space where we interrogate the historical and ideological perspectives of anti-Black thinking so we can reimagine a world for Black and Brown people to do more than just survive, because we know what we don't name, we normalize. And this is Beyond the Episode, where we take the conversation deeper with brilliant voices in you, our live community. Today, we are continuing the conversation from episode 5, discussing what happens when belonging requires Black and Brown people to split themselves apart in order to be accepted or to be seen as professional, safe, or worthy. In episode 5, we grounded the conversation in The Souls of Black Folk, written by W.E.B. Du Bois, where they introduce double consciousness as the experience of Black and Brown people constantly seeing oneself through the eyes of a society that devalues their humanity. Du Bois is clear that this idea was produced through slavery, segregation, and educational systems that denied Black people their full humanity. I'm really excited to jump into this conversation. We are joined by two special guests, Dr. Sean Brown, Doctor of Education, and Jasmine Pickens, Assistant Director of Harvard Debate Council. So let's jump into it. I would love to start our conversation off, Dr. Brown or Jasmine, to just tell us a little bit about what resonated with you most in episode 5 about double consciousness.
Yep. I've been working in K-12 education for the last 10 or 11 or so years. Been a school administrator for the last 7. And I'm also founder of my own educational consulting company. So all my work is about Black literacy and trying to advance the outcomes for Black students in K-12 schools, mostly in the charter world. What resonated with us from the episode, there are a lot of things that resonated. I think with me, the big one was just the idea of how double consciousness is something that emerges within us before language is even developed. And I immediately connected that to my own experience and how we're taught how to act, how to behave, how to exist as even Black children in spaces by our parents. And so, like, that means, like, you can't run around the grocery store. You can't, act a fool in the aisle like you see, like, the other kids doing of other race or whatever, like, because, you'll be in trouble. But we accept that, learn that, and it becomes a part of us. And then we become adults, we also internalize that to meaning like, well, I can't speak this way or act this way in these settings around these people because my whole life I've been told to, operate in a certain way. So that was the big one that really hit me as soon as I saw the episode.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Jasmine, what about you?
Yes. Awesome. Very happy to be here. Thank you, Nell and Larry, for the opportunity. So, a little bit about me and like the work that I do. I am the assistant director for the Harvard Debate Council and have been not an educator in the traditional sense, right? Working in the classroom, but very adjacent to it. A lot of my current work is based in program development and curriculum design, both domestically and internationally, which is very exciting because there are a lot of different cultural differences amongst young people, but a lot of similarities at the same time. But in doing a lot of that travel and that curriculum design, there are different kind of cultural awarenesses and differences that students know about Blackness, which is like interesting, and having to like navigate that and almost really representative of a group of people where maybe predominantly there aren't as many Black folks in the space that they occupy. So for me, I think that connects really well to like things that resonated in the episode 5, and specifically the question of how do we define Blackness? We communicate with each other within these kind of complex experiences within Blackness. And I'm sure we'll have more, nuanced conversations as this discussion goes. But I thought that was very interesting in terms of the way that we kind of standardize Blackness as its antagonism to whiteness. Am I being white enough instead of is my Blackness as it exists right now enough? But then how do we define that Blackness? Is it always in opposition to what whiteness defines it as being, and saying, oh, no, I'm not that kind of Black person. I'm not this kind of Black person. Well, yes, if we define Blackness in opposition to what whiteness defines it, then it's very confusing. And so I really resonated with a lot of those questions that were asked and really trying to think through how I have defined that throughout my, younger years and now in my career. And also as I, in many ways, are the first encounter and engagement, or not the first, but relatively, intimate engagement on an intellectual level that students have with a Black person. And I don't take that lightly, but it definitely does bring back a lot of, memories and ideas of feeling as though you are representing a race when you are just an individual. So it's interesting, but I really enjoyed the episode and looking forward to talking more about it.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you lifting this idea of, Black identity and the way in which even within our Black identity, we splinter ourselves because we try to define ourselves as this Black person versus that Black person. That actually brings us to the first like thought that I want us to kind of grapple with for a minute when we think about this idea of like splitting ourselves apart. Like, where do we feel like in our life or maybe in society where we feel the most pressure or where we feel this sense of double consciousness the most? I think in my own experience, and I've said this in previous episodes, I grew up in a very religious household, and I think I was very unaware of how race operated in my life because, religion in my mind is juxtaposed to whiteness. And so I didn't have a concept of my race or my identity being relevant or important or impacting me and my experience. And so I'm very curious to hear from you all, like where in your life you felt the most pressure, or maybe even now you feel the most pressure to splinter yourself when we think about this idea of double consciousness.
For me, it's 100% professional. I I think there's no other area of my life where I feel the expectation, I'll say, to be something other than who I am. I would say that like now, so like I'm older, I'm an administrator, business owner. I don't have that same pressure, but especially early on as an educator, having to prove that I was still intelligent, I could still do the work, I could still teach, etc. Even though, as if that's a thing, even though I was Black. And even to the point of having to like excelling as a teacher, doing well as a teacher, getting data, as we say, as a teacher, doing all those things. And still, I remember an instance where this is probably my third year or fourth year teaching. A district leader said he said about me that you should just let him manage the class and let this new white woman teacher instruct. And this is after I'd already like gotten data achieved, all the things. And I was onboarding this new teacher. I was her grade team lead and all of these things. And he's saying, like, just let this young Black kid, like let him just be there and make sure the kids don't act up, but let her actually teach. And so like experiences like that teach you inadvertently, but maybe even on purpose, teach you that the way in which you show up, even if you like get the numbers, whatever, or achieve whatever success looks like in your field, that you still don't belong, right? And in order to belong, you have to either like fit the mold that they want you to fit, or just play the sidelines and let them, you know, shine or whatever. But that's definitely like it was a huge moment for me of realizing like even though I could do all these things, I did it well and better than a lot of people that didn't look like me, didn't matter. Like to the eyes of the people making the decisions, this was a Black man and he should not be the one to own instruction or whatever, delivering it because of how he looked or because how he fits into this space. So like that was a pivotal instance in my life that opened my eyes to this idea that, oh, you need to be different. And I think from that moment on, I will say that I try very hard to not be overtly Black. And I had to unlearn that, right? So like, let me like be not so Black that it offends people, not so myself, right? That it makes people uncomfortable. But that also has a detrimental effect on like my own well-being, right? As well as it makes me less effective at doing my job because like what I learned later, like tying my Blackness to who I was as an educator, like that's natural, right? In order for me to be my best self, I have to bring all of that to the table. And if I try to curtail that in any way, that I'm not giving kids what they deserve, I'm not pushing them because I'm not even pushing myself. And like really what I'm teaching them is to just do what I'm doing, which is hide, right? But yeah, they all framed from that moment really like put the light bulb on like, hey, like if you want to survive in this world, you have to be different. You can't be yourself.
I think something that you named that's really like sticking out to me is two things. So one, I think that the piece you named around when you get into the professional field, specifically like in education, like the hyper political ways in which we are told that our labor is valued, but we are not. Right? And how, like, that's exactly what I thought about. One of my friends writes a poem where she talks about belting a song from backstage while the white girl lip sings in the front, and like that metaphor of our labor being valuable, but who we are in our personhood not being valuable or even being fungible, right? Like being disposable. And I think that like very early on we learned that, and you name that as an adult in like your professional sense, but like even as a kid, like I'm watching interactions with my little black child at the pool where like the kids are like she's in spaces where kids don't look like her, right? Like she's in a lot of spaces where kids don't look like her because I've been afforded like material access to those spaces, and like kids not wanting to play with her when she's very much being friendly, like, hey, I want to play, blah, blah, blah. And they're kind of being like, and then like they see her swimming and now they're like, oh, teach me how to swim. And I'm like, wow, she's 3, right? Like here are the ways that from such a young age, we are shown our talents, our skill set are valuable to this world, but we are not. And so you really elevated that for me in what you named. And I think the last piece of what you named is like why it is so important for us to show up whole. We talk about this a little bit on the episode when Larry and I discuss like what do you lose? But you named this piece around like if I don't show up as authentically myself, maybe that fits for civil society or maybe that fits for the structures and systems that I'm in, but I am internally like dead, right? Like I'm internally like suffering because I don't get to show up as myself. And so thank you for lifting that because I think this is what we get at when like Du Bois he starts to have this conversation, but I don't think he goes there enough around like how this plays out in our daily lives.
Yeah, great thought. I also think one of the things you said, Dr. Brown, was this idea that when you were, covering this classroom with this white lady, they didn't see you as the person that should be delivering instruction, even though you had the results or have already produced results. And I think that that was an unfortunate experience for you to have. But I think that also, reflects the anti-Blackness that exists. Like our minds are not seen as competent or able to perform at the same academic level as our white counterpart. And so we do get pushed into these, culture, behavior roles. And it's just like, that feels violent to me. And it's unfortunate that you had that experience, but I think that's the reason why it's so important for us to reflect on, how the world reads us and reads our identity and how we are not affirmed in, the ways in which we should be affirmed and how we are seen as like the other. And so I appreciate you lifting that. One of the most powerful arguments when we think about the book that Du Bois wrote, one of the most powerful arguments from his book was that, Black people are not confused about who we are. The conflict comes from us being forced to live in a society that refuses to see us fully. And double consciousness is then that pressure of knowing ourself while also being conscious of how the world misreads us. And so I'm curious to talk about now when you all think about this idea of double consciousness, does like adapting to the world because we are in this double conscious way of thinking, when does that become survival and when does that become self-erasure? I think Dr. Brown, you talked a little bit about your survival. You talked a little bit about having to navigate this space with this white lady who, was seen as a person that should be delivering instruction. So I'm curious to know like how we feel about, when we feel like we're surviving a moment through our double consciousness or when we feel like we might be erasing, ourselves through our double consciousness.
Yeah, and I do want to elevate Jasmine's voice just because we haven't heard from you yet. And I think like something I'm curious about is like what I don't think Du Bois gets into is beyond double consciousness, triple consciousness, quadruple consciousness, like how even amidst us having those experiences external to our communities, how they also live within our communities in figuring out who we are and erasing who we are.
Sorry. Yes. Sorry. Every single time that you all say things, I like, go deep into thought and I started taking own notes for own personal reasons of like, wow, discourse is fun. And so to answer the question just head on, right, of when does it become survival and when does it become erasure? I think those things inherently are the same thing in a world that is anti-Black. And so what do I think inherently that as we work in these professional spaces and we work with people, right, who don't hold or understand the same type of epistemological frames that Black folks have had to like go through, i.e., the way that we learn how to speak, the way that within the double consciousness, you still have to live, breathe, eat, understand the world in the same way that your white counterparts, non-Black counterparts do as well as having the kind of forbidden knowledge, it feels like at times, of your Blackness as a lens to understand these things, either you understanding that lens or not. And so I don't think that they're necessarily a moment where one is erasure, one is survival. I think survival is erasure, but it's one that you kind of either not accept, but you try to nullify the impact of it. And so when I think about that in the context of my particular, experiences, I would be remiss if I don't think about it in the context of being a Black woman and what it means to provide institutional care, which I think is oftentimes erased in the overarching register of like labor and work. And that is those moments where you're thinking about the feelings of, or the emotional regulation of everyone else in the room and always thinking, how do I say this? Or how do I make myself smaller or more palatable in order to get the job done or to make students feel empowered? Because inevitably I work with individuals who are younger than me. And so what happens when a student is being anti-Black? I can't inherently be like, hey, kid, you're being anti-Black and the worst individual cretin in society. That's unprofessional, right? But that statement could be true, but I can't meet it with that energy. It's always a learning opportunity, even if it is hurtful towards me, right? Or if there are communication affects that are different, where the way that I am being spoken to or the presumptions about the care that I will just do, oh, Jasmine, you're just good at that. I'm just good at talking to kids, which is like our job that we all must be good at doing. I'm glad that it's being highlighted that I am just, exceptional at this particular job. All of these things are coded, right? And when I say like the part that you have to accept in that erasure is that I still care about the kids. I still care about what I am producing. And so while I know that I'm being put into a place, I do that place work very well. Yeah, I must say, And so I know that I am more than that, but oftentimes it is just either just easier to be in that place and keep the space regulating in a generally peaceful, copacetic way, but internally just be very much so, not rageful, but just as it builds, apathetic, maybe even resentful at times, because those same outbursts, those same, sidebar, one-off, statements that your peers can make where you're like, okay, that was charged, or I'm going to let that roll off my shoulder, but like, I know what that was. And I would like to believe that you individual in this exchange knew what that was, but I'm not going to name it because I have to focus overall on the space, how to make things work, move, because inevitably I do think that Black women are part of the process of making things work and move and get from point A to point B. And that I do think comes at the expense of our internal engagement with this double consciousness that we're actively aware of. So, yeah.
Something that you just said that I thought about was also similar to what Sean was naming around internalizing just like the expectations that the world has on us. And I think I really care about people receiving our podcasts, our conversations as indictments of ideology as opposed to indictments of people. And the reason why I say that is because I've had like white colleagues say things to me like, girl, you could do academics and you're like a academic powerhouse, you're a culture powerhouse, like, and have to remind me like I can do both, even though I'm getting pushed into culture. Like, and I think, this is an indictment of ideology and mindset more than it is an indictment of individual people, because we also have people within our own communities that think only we can do culture or only we can engage in this type of labor, which is a misconception as well. And so I think something that we have to be mindful of in what Jasmine named around being in these spaces and knowing X thing is charged is like, it's hard because we say anything you don't name, you normalize, but sometimes it's so overwhelming, the amount of things to name and interrupt, that is like, all right, what battle am I going to choose right now? Like, what is the path that's going to lead to, honestly, the least retribution, because I got to pay my bills, like, or I got to take care of my child, like, and that has been the hardest thing for me. Is I very much was Malcolm X's daughter until I had a daughter, and I'm like, dang, so I think it very much feels like this double bind that you're in, that like, I am conscious of this, I can name this, I also need to survive this. And there's been moments where I was like, whatever, I'm naming it. And I saw the consequences or retaliation, as much as retaliation is illegal, follow that, right? And so I think that is something that we have to navigate in our Blackness for sure.
Yeah, I really appreciate you, Nell, and Jasmine for lifting this idea. One thing that you said, Jasmine, that really resonated with me is, I know that I am operating in this space, and I know that I might be splintering myself, but I'm here to produce a result. And I think that is something that I have grappled with and I resonate with at the same time, because if I have to silence myself because I'm trying to, push, something, for the greater community, what am I then losing? The grappling part that I now have with this double consciousness, what am I then losing to do it? And I think that's something that, is very real, especially if you're in a leadership position and you have to manage people, and you have to manage people that, don't look like Black people, that aren't Black and brown people. You have to manage them. Like, you also have to figure out, like, how do I help them? And I think I said this in part of the episode, and I think you lifted this, Jasmine, like, I need to say this thing. I need to do this thing. How are people that I have to say or do this thing with going to receive it? What do I then have to do? The splintering, the double consciousness that happens, what do I have to do so that they can receive it? I think that that's a very difficult thing to navigate, as people that experience double consciousness. So I just appreciate you lifting that. I also think about, as we move up, as we think about like belonging and what it means to belong in these spaces when it's conditional. We know belonging should not require, Black and brown people to shrink, to soften, to translate, or to perform a version of themselves that makes others feel comfortable. And yet we are socially conditioned through, schools specifically, to still communicate, in a particular way so that Black and brown people can belong if we just adjust our language or our tone or adjust how we dress, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious for us to reflect on any experiences that you've had in an institution, or maybe in any particular lived experience where there was this unspoken rule that you had to be a particular way to be accepted in that space. And I know for me, like, when I was working at the bank, and I mentioned this briefly in my podcast, like, I started growing my locks out, and my manager at the time had a comment towards me. I'm not going to repeat the comment, but had a comment towards me that did not particularly feel affirming. And I felt very hyper aware, like, oh, my locks are not professional in the banking world. So I guess I, need to not have them. And then that actually in that moment emboldened me to keep growing my locks out. Cause I'm like, nope, this is actually fine. My hair naturally curls, and I'm going to lock my hair. But I think that, for me was an instance where I had to choose between, splintering myself to assimilate to this way of professional look versus, no, I'm just going to lock my hair because that's what I want to do with my hair that curls, But I think that is very nuanced, and it looks different depending on the context that you find yourself in.
I also think something that, like, Sean, you talked about this in, like, our pre-live conversation around how you felt very much like your unapologetic Black self until you got into the workforce. And it makes me also think about the ways that, like, this need to split or this force into this double consciousness also, like, pushes us to have more discord within our communities because we feel even resentment towards each other when some folks are choosing to assimilate, and you're like, I'm advocating for us and you sitting here assimilating, like, but then it'd be like, dang, you're surviving. And it's so hard because it's like you want people that look like you within your community to understand why we have an accountability to saying the thing, and why we have an accountability to disrupting systems, and you also empathize with them in their survival, right? And I think that that's very hard. And Jasmine named something like, well, I don't want to say that it's rage, but like Baldwin names this explicitly, like to be conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage. And like, that's a real thing because once you are aware, you cannot be unaware. Like, once you are aware, it is impossible to unsee. And so you are seeing consistently, even within your own communities, even within people that look like you, and that is exhausting. Like, that is exhausting to be like, sis, I want you to be on our team, but like, I get why you're not on our team, and I need you to be on our team. Like, and I think that that's really hard to navigate. But what I hear Larry saying around like packaging things so people can receive them and learn, it just for me feels like we're always being brought to then having to do the labor again when the thing is happening to us, but we have to do the labor to teach. We have to do the labor for people to unlearn. And I just want to figure out and imagine a world in which that is not our focus. I won't say that that doesn't exist because I don't know that that happens in our lifetime, but that it is not our focus to labor for others.
As you were talking, I was thinking about there's a phrase that my coach gave me. I say gave me, but I'm really stealing it. It is for Black educators in particular. There's this idea of profound additional responsibility to where like I have this responsibility to be an educator, obviously in the general sense to like get the next generation ready for the workforce, life, whatever. But then also I have to show up in a way that is like life giving to the Black youth that see me doing this work. Right. And then there's like other responsibilities also, because I've had like plenty of like Black educators looking to the other Black educators to like how to support me as I do this, or the Black women educators who I've had in my life tell me like, don't fall apart. Like this is just part of the process. You're gonna be okay. Like all the responsibilities that we have, and all of that is labor. And I don't know, like to your point, like there's probably a world that we get to, hopefully, where we don't have to do the labor, but all of that is labor, right? I have the work of like being my full self to a degree so that people can see what that looks like, but also not being my full self so much that I don't have the opportunity to do this work, which gives you the chance to see me anyway. And so like all of that is happening at the same time. And I think about like what you said about Baldwin and like being in the race, and I don't know how to emotionally process what happens all the time without some form of anger. But like as I've gotten older, that anger like turns in anger becomes fuel to do things in a more productive way than just be angry, right? Like I've been angry, did things, and almost lost a job, and and now like I'm angry and I like pull somebody in and I teach them, and this so like is like how you use it varies, right? Where you are in life. But I'll say this, and this is also something that we named like a few days ago. We talked, and I think like Black people, particularly as we deal with this double consciousness, we have to understand that everyone is in a different place in that journey, right? Are they aware of it? Are they doing it in spite of being aware? Everybody's in a different place, and so it requires us to give each other grace and to say like, you might be at the very beginning of this, and I can see myself in you, right? And so I'm not gonna shut you down completely because I know how it feels to when you first encounter this. And for me, like, I didn't really encounter it again until like I was in a professional setting and I realized like, hey, you can't be this black, this big, this male and survive and succeed and be promoted. Like, you have to figure out like how to do this differently. And until I got to a place where I was like, you know what, I've done enough. I don't care how you feel. I'm gonna be me. And so like everyone is in a different place, and I think it's incumbent upon us to like give people grace for where they are in their journey.
Feel like you guys were having this discussion. I'm Jasmine. I'm glad you were about to talk because I was about to ask you to talk about it when I logged on initially. But I hear Sean saying labor inevitable, and it sounds like capitalism. So I know you're about to speak, Jasmine, but yeah, I just think us forwarding that conversation is going to be important right now.
Yeah, digesting everything. And it really sometimes you just kind of sit and you think, because we're talking about double consciousness while being double sentient individuals, right? So it's very meta. It's very like Inception to talk about your consciousness while being conscious. That's interesting. But yeah, no, the labor inevitable. I heard that as a debate argument. And I would say perhaps. I don't think that in a world of late stage capitalism, whichever you believe that we are in, that labor is something that we unsubscribe out of because it's like a paradigm of play. So I used that phrase a few days ago when we were kind of digesting episode 5 with Nal and Larry. What I mean by paradigmatic play, and I think of this through like folks such as like Dr. Frank B. Wilderson, when he says that if we think of the world like a chessboard, every chess piece has a particular prescribed role assigned to it, right? A pawn only has certain moves. A rook only has certain moves. A horse or a knight only has a certain moves. But then he asked the question, well, what do we do if we reassign the role of the pawn to the queen? What does this now change about the dynamic of the board? Are we still playing chess, or is something else or something different taking place? And I take a moment to kind of bring up this metaphor to think through labor being inevitable, because labor is inevitable if we are playing the game of chess that is capitalism. Every role, every identity is circumscribed by a notion of capital and proving oneself as valuable as a commodity to be like moved around the marketplace. That is modernity, this world. Right here. Everything is based on I'm using my time to accumulate myself as a valuable subject for the world. I am resisting certain value statements and reasserting new moments of value so that this system can recognize that I have value. These things are all trapped in a kind of perspective of proving oneself as valuable, laboring. And so underneath that phrase, even thought is a form of labor exploitation, because when you sleep, you are thinking about how can you think through making yourself better or more palatable or resistant to terms that never belong to you. And I think that that's something that I want to keep here, right? Is that these tropes that are tied to Blackness don't belong to us, but are assigned to us. And so long as we are understanding, capitalism, the world, anti-Blackness, as this particular paradigm, yes, labor is inevitable. But then if we were to think about what does it mean to reassign the role of the queen, and not just like make the queen the pawn, the queen, etc., but what does that then reshape about the system of, economics and sociality that we are prescribed of? And I think that the last thing that I'll say, I think that we are blueprints to this answer, because I think that Black folks have lived at the intersection of time, space, art, and history, because we move history, we move modernity, we move time. And so if that is the case, the future is in us, the past is in us, and the present is in us. We just have to unlearn the idea that we are we are the assigned value that the world requires to move the world. The moment that we do that, I think that yes, there is work that we must do, but I think work is different than labor. Many folks write about this distinction. Labor as a commodified entity, work as like just the literal work that you need to do to disentangle and to collectivize and to commune, to build something and to create new value systems that are not based off of antagonism and living through resistance. That's what I would say to kind of think through is like, where do we as Black folks put our work into each other, and how are we redefining things, not based off of proving ourselves to a system that does not define us, but that we're trying to redefine, because we're trying to, instead of being a brand new dictionary, we're trying to find new words in thesaurus, right? Like, I'm not this, but maybe I'm this instead. Babes, in order to reconstruct language, you got to completely create a new dictionary, create a new definition, not create synonyms for the same definition because we think they're more palatable and interesting and less antagonistic. It's like, no, new book, but we are the ink. And that's like what people write. Black people are the ink, right? That writes grammar. We are the world. So that's what I'll say on that. And when I think of what is the work that we're willing to do.
Drops mic, drops mic, drops mic.
Exactly. Drops the mic. Look, I really, Jasmine, resonate with what you said specifically about world making, because I think there's a part, and Paul Freire in his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed talks a lot about, that work, this idea that we have to act upon reality. And I think about, this idea that we are always operating from the past. Like, we have all these traditions and concepts and ways of being that are representative of past thinking, but there's a moment in that thought where we can actually imagine something different. And I think between the history, the traditions that we uphold or that we continue to ascribe to, and the now of, I'm thinking about this tradition or this thing that I'm going to do that I've always done, and there's an opportunity for me to do something different. Like, that is the space where we're like creating a new world. And so I really appreciate you, Jasmine, like lifting this idea and just how important it is for us to engage in that work, specifically as Black people who are responsible for creating that world for us. Like, and I think sometimes I'll say become discouraged because of all of the things that we have to navigate. And it sometimes feels, you've said this, Nell, exhausting to do. But it's like, if we don't do it for anybody else, we do it for the Black community, because we know that we have to create our own world within a system that does not value us and that is constantly devaluing our life. So
yeah, my hand is up because there's so many thoughts right now. I almost quoted Nas just then, but I'm gonna quote Octavia Butler. She writes that there's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. And I thought about that while Jasmine was talking. It's the idea that there are new ways of being that we have the power to create. And to answer, I think, a question I heard, but is how then, like, what does that look like? Because as the lone employee or educator somewhere just fighting against a system that is way larger than you and exists way longer than you, then it seems like a futile mission and you're always laboring to overcome it. But the idea of collectivism, how do like Black people, what is like Afro collectivism look like, where we combine our talents and skill sets to build things? And there are people who are excuse me, building schools, building organizations, being entrepreneurs and building businesses, whatever, that look and feel like us and our culture, and doing it within the context of like this country and society that we live in, but they're doing it in a way that participating in whatever they're building gives life to the participants. And I think that that's exactly what like Octavia Butler makes me think about, like, where are we building the new suns that then like give life and energy to other Black people who then go out and build something else? And like, let's always have a spark of something that we wish existed that didn't exist before us. And like, how do we go out and do that thing? We don't do it alone. Like, we definitely do it when we're empowered by other people who have experienced what we're experiencing and decide to do something anyway. And I think like collectivism becomes an answer to like, how do we like end this perpetual, inevitable, labor? Like, how does it become something that can end? It ends when we decide to do this thing together and not alone.
I really appreciate you lifting that. And our next episode that's going to drop June 15th, just have to put that in there. We talk about community as a lever. And so it gets exactly at what you're describing. And I think the biggest piece that I'm thinking about as Jasmine talks, as Larry talks, as you talk, is this idea of moving from a space of like engaging in liberal progress and being like, we need to change, as opposed to we need to define, right? Like, I think that change is predicated on us making something that was into something new as opposed to defining who I am. I think that as humans, we have so much of a desire to control that people want to. I remember one of my previous managers said to me, like, I got some teachers to come to her school, and she was like, how are all your friends just so smart and creative and talented? I'm like, because I'm so smart and creative and talented, right? Like, and it was hard for her to conceptualize that I could be in this role as a school administrator and have a podcast and do this, like, and it was so hard for her to conceptualize because in her mind, school administrator looks like X, a teacher looks like X, and we can only exist in a particular way. But we know Black people and history shows us this. We are multifaceted, and it is important that not only are we teaching Black and brown children about the ways in which they can be multifaceted in this world, but also to be aware of the ways in which that will intimidate this world because they want you to be in a particular way and you are not that particular way. And now they're like, oh no, we need to categorize you. And it's like, continue. The quote I said to Larry, I think it was the live or the episode, and I was like, Audre Lorde, if I don't define myself for myself, I'll be crushed into the world's fantasies for me and eaten alive. Like, that's a real thing, and why it is important for us to encourage defining, encourage creating something that may not exist. It doesn't exist because you're the blueprint, right? To Jasmine's point, like, we are the ink. So that's why it doesn't exist. Stop looking for it to exist. It doesn't exist. Create it, right? Like, and I think that, like, that's what all of you speaking made me think about.
Yeah, no, I'd say thank you, Dr. Brown, for that like collectivism call because like, yes. And then to know now is to know, yes, this lady is plural, multifaceted AF. And I say that respectfully. But
I second that.
right, like, to know her is to know that. But I do think that like we are inherently this. And I just feel called to like own little not stamp, but like just what immediately makes me kind of think of where are we doing the collective work? How do we become so multi-plural? So much work is being done, and I think so much work has been done. And I would be remiss if I didn't like just like say a few lines that I think resonate with me and have resonated with me ever since like they were published. And so when we think of not defining based off of antagonism or resisting and thinking of ourselves in that multi-state, these are the lines that like always sit with me, right? And they're not my own, cannot claim them. They're from like Dr. Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who is inspired a lot by Dr. Horton Spillers, which for me, that's OG biblical text. It just is what it is, red, white, and in color. And she says, I am before that. I am not born this morning when you wake up in fear and look frantic for breakfast to belittle, for something to burn and consume. I am before that, present like dew and like steam and like dreams without request. I am not assembled on demand when you suddenly don't know what to say. I am before that. I am structure of bone. I am contour of clay. I am paradigm of play. Hence where, I get that from. I do not arrive, I stay. Before black is bad and broken, I am more. I am not coin or token. I am the deepest spell spoken, and you are shook. I am the energy of birth that you took. When slavery is crawling, I am grown. I am fierce. I am known. I am continent lines. The seed is long since sown. I have flown. When blood becomes brown, I am the shaved head crown. When domination wants a name, I am old. Before my sweat is sold, I am gold. I am circular story retold. And so for me, what does all of this culminate in, and how do I think of it, is that long before there was a me, there was a we. And in order for me to know that my life, I won't speak for others, but it's how I guide and think about other Black folks' lives and people's lives too, is that in order for me to know that my Blackness has value, did not come from the world. It did not come from educational spaces. It did not come from what the world wanted to define Blackness as. It came from those hidden whispers, that forbidden knowledge that was passed down. And I won't say ancestors just as who is dead, because it begs the question of what is death, right? things do not die with the body. They're carried on and they have material resonance and they affect us. And I think that because of the work that Black women have done, right, that care, that they've made that time, they create worlds that do not follow linear notions of what's in the past is in the past, it's in the present, in the present, in the futures. No, like that work has started. It's when we see it. And when we don't define ourselves based off of a necessity or a need for this world, and by world, I'll be specific, I'll name like institutional kind of like focus on drives for capitalism or kind of the corporate machine for what is the trend on defining Blackness for the day, or that you have to perform excellence, even though we are excellent by birth. So I think that anything else that we do, we have to beg the question of who for. But even before any of that, it is to know that like the work that you, like who your existence is the blueprint. We say this. So then when I think of Nell and her multifacetedness, and I think of everything that these folks have shared about what they have done and how they have navigated their double consciousness, it's like, how did you have the energy to do that? What gave you that critical spark that told you cognitive, like on a cognitive dissonant way of, this ain't really adding up. Something's in the water, right? Like a gust of wind hit me and something tells me that is because we do that social work, both past, present, in the future for each other. What we are doing right now on this podcast and in life, through the tears, through the labor, through the exploitation, through the success, through the failure, right? Spills. That's the phrase. That's the name of the poem that I just read from, right? It's like everything has a resonance and it will be captured. Yes, commodified on some level, because like, when you're the blueprint, you're attracted to it, but it will also spill into nourishing the cracks underneath the pavement for Black children that come years and years, after who we are. So it matters how we are seeking each other and like our lives. And I think that that understanding of connection and that I am not here or understanding of my awareness as a solely me awakening, but as a result and an ongoing process of care work that is done that transcends time, history, and art, that feels important. And it not only feels it, it is. It just like it's like one of those it is. Like I can tell you, I can't cook it, I can't build you a recipe. It just is. And I think that that intrinsic it just isness is the thing that can never be commodified because it can't be found, right? It's stolen. It's here. It's not. It's transient. It's, tactile. I'm going to stop ranting. But like when I hear this kind of collectiveness question, I just think, wow, what a beautiful thing it is that we know that this internal knowledge of we are always we. And in that we are still an I, like my individualism still does matter, but like the value that I place on myself did not come solely from me, nor the future kids, future generations. What they know of themselves does not come solely from them, because what a lonely world that is if you are solely responsible for understanding and defining yourself after hundreds of thousands of years of existence prior to you heavy on your shoulders. What an awesome thing it is to know that that is not the case, is what I'll say on that.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. It's beautiful to think about like our humanity, as Black and brown people, and how, Nell, you said this, ontologically excellent we are in everything that we do. I do want to bring us to our final part as we wrap up this conversation, because Du Bois, one of the concepts that he brings up is this idea of warring inner life, and that the source of that war is a social war, and that the solution, to everyone's point, is not only individual, but it's the collective. We often, tell people to be confident, authentic, or unapologetic, but Du Bois, in his writing pushes us to think deeper about how we transform conditions for ourselves through the self-love that we sustain through our communities. And so I would love, as we reflect on all of the points that Jasmine brought up and that was brought up in this conversation, to think about how that resonates.
Something I'm thinking about is this piece Jasmine was naming, and then connects to your question around like, what does self-love look like in the context of collectivism? And I think that like something that I've been working on is I'm creating a poetry album. And when people keep asking me like, why are you doing this? I'm like, I was like, I have pieces that if God forbid I died today, nobody would have access to because they're literally in my head. Like I perform them, but I don't have them in writing. I don't have them in a voice memo. And I'm like, that's so terrible because then my daughter doesn't have access to this information that is a streamline of my consciousness, a streamline of my experiences to be able to navigate her own experience, right? And so I think about the ways in which work looks like pouring into each other in ways that live beyond, to Jasmine's point, time and space, because the reason why modernity exists how it exists because somebody put something in writing that is existing beyond time and space. And so then we need to put stuff in writing that exists beyond time and space. And I think that, the spoken word artist stems from the griot from West Africa, and they were the oral historians. And so, that's great. We can pass down oral stories, but what are the ways that we're writing ourselves into in beyond material existence? And so I think writing is a piece of that. I think creating structures and systems that exist beyond you. So communities, books and breakfast is something that I think about, but different programs that can exist beyond our material existence because it means we have a legacy, and not for capitalism, which we know will consume it, but for the people in our community that need these things to survive beyond our material existence.
My inner blurred or whatever is showing to be very happy because they all talking about poetry. I wrote a book of poetry. I love poetry. One of my favorite poets, actually my favorite poet of all time, modern poet, Saul Williams. He wrote a poem. This called Shaklack Clack or something. Either way, he's like, I am before, and I am before that. And I was thinking about that while you were talking, Jasmine, and now while you were talking, and how like there are parts of us, and I'm gonna try not to preach because I want y'all to write me back, but there are parts of us that are like deposited and created in us before we exist. Right before we exist in this capitalist environment, right? And so it's impossible to be your full self and only be the thing that capitalism is telling you is valuable, right? Like you can't just be the thing that you do for a living. Like you can't just be the banker. You can't just be the policeman. You can't just be the educator, because in you is also the poet, in you is also the administrator, in you is also the scholar. And like in order for you to be your full self, you have to do all of those things, right? And I think it's for us, it's incumbent that we are, because then we also give people permission to also be those things themselves, right? And I think for so long, my frustration personally has been like, I just need to be good at this one thing that society says I'm good at. Oh, you can teach, so just be this thing, right? But actually, no, like I am also a preacher and a poet and a writer and a scholar, and I have to. And right, and I found that gives permission to the students we teach, to children we have, the family members that we have, to also be their full selves. And I think that is, in terms of solutions, like that is like how we get to a world, or the world that we need to be, so that we can all exist in without having to always think about the white gaze, right? I don't think about the white gaze when I'm being all of these things, when I'm being myself. I'm thinking about like, how do I get what's in me out, right? And focusing on that gives us a kind of freedom that we don't often encounter when we're inside of like corporate America or whatever institutionalized whatever that this society is giving us, and saying that this is where we have to be excel. This is where you have to be like valuable at, right? But I think there's a freedom in just being able to be everything that you feel yourself to be, right? And a lot of times that the stuff that we feel on the inside that we are to be doesn't necessarily equate to like monetizing it right off the bat, right? Like, and I think we're in a society where like, if you can't make money off this thing right now, if I can't put this on TikTok or YouTube or whatever right now, then maybe I shouldn't be it. And so then that comes the sacrificing of ourselves, right? So I'm not gonna do this because it's not gonna make me money. If it doesn't make me money, it won't pay my rent. If it doesn't pay my rent, then I don't know what to do for my family. So like, I can't do it. But in essence, like that's soul killing work that we're doing, right? Instead of saying, you know what, I'm gonna be this anyway because it's who I am. And like, no, like you said, like I'm gonna leave this to my kids. And this is a legacy. Like now this becomes like me leaving the legacy of my full self to the next generation, which gives them permission to be their full self. And then we go forward from there. But like, it's all choosing to, Jasmine, like choosing to not engage with the chessboard. Like if this is like if I'm the queen, king, whatever on this chessboard, right, and I have to be in order to have value, and this is the parameters I have to move in. Like who's to say that one day I don't have to look at the chessboard at all, and like I'm not gonna play this game with you, right? I'm actually gonna be who I am created to be, who I believe God put me here to be, and whatever that looks like. So and that's the choice I'm going to leave with the next generation so they can make the same choice. And then the world looks so much different because we're not a bunch of people trying to fit our round cells in these square pegs, right? We're just being our full self, being the sons that then like fuel society or whatever that comes after us. And I'll stop rambling. But like, I'm just really inspired by hearing all the things that we're saying.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that lift. I do want to ask each of us when we think about our, our current experiences, life experiences, what responsibility do we have, do we hold in our communities to support Black and Brown people in navigating this experience of double consciousness? I think for me as a administrator at a middle school where specifically my function is culture, I'm often thinking about how I firmly believe schools are sites of resistance because education is a site of resistance. A Black and Brown child being able to read and understand the world, to take in knowledge, to be able to then use that knowledge and apply it in a real way to resist the anti-Blackness that they have to navigate is, for me, my rally cry when I think about how I support students in schools to resist, the anti-Blackness, the double conscious way of thinking. I also think about, from a culture perspective, how some of my, colleagues, including administrators, have internalized ways of thinking about Black and Brown students that do not affirm them. They hyper or over sensationalize, like their behavior and problematize it in a way that is just not helpful. And so and then students internalize that very hyper reaction as, them being a bad kid or something. And it's just like, we can separate the person from the action, because children are children, they're learning. But like as an administrator, how do I not only model the response that we have to children's behavior, Black children specifically, so it's not, over sensationalized, but then also reaffirm that child like, yep, you made a mistake and we're moving on. This is what you can do differently next time. And so, I'm always concerned about how do I help, and model for my students, like resisting the ways in which the world views them, including their own teachers and the own administrators that they have to interact with in the building.
I think for me, I know we're going to be closing this conversation out soon, so I'll keep it brief. But I think for me, like I care less about, and I think I said this in maybe the first episode about how I said to this student at my school, like, girl, you want these white people to think blah, blah, blah about you? And she said, I don't care what the white people think about me. And that moment for me was like, I actually care less about teaching you to resist. Like, I actually care more about you having that mindset, like to know what they think, so that for your own awareness of the inevitable violences that will exist because of the ways in which capitalism operates, because of the way in which anti-Blackness operates, but to not use that as your value system, to not use that as your metric system, to recognize I don't actually derive value from these institutions. Like I derive value from myself, and that is something that has to be taught. And I won't say taught, I will say like relearned, because I think we know it and it is silence. And so then we have to relearn it. But I think that like that is the work that I'm invested in, is like, how do you define who you are so that as you encounter the things that are true of this world that we live in, they do not shake your center. They do not shake what you believe because you're like, that's about you and not about me. I think that's the mindset that I care about supporting our children in normalizing, that that's about you and not about me. Right. And I think that is a useful mindset in navigating the things that we have to navigate being Black in this world.
Yeah, I would love to get your thoughts on this, Jasmine, and Dr. Brown, when you think about your own experiences, in your community where you work, etc.
Like I said, we're saying be brief. I'm gonna do this like hopefully in bullet points. Personally, I'm the eldest daughter right? I have siblings who I care deeply about, and I think that that's my call to care about myself and to take care of myself and to think through what does care look like interpersonally so that I'm a whole or attempting at whole person that is authentic and honest in whatever I kind of spill out, right? I don't want to reproduce forms of anti-Blackness because we all have the capacity to do so with these like ideas of, oh, I'm tired, I can't hear you. Or, you know what, I will try to, extend myself to a point where I have nothing left. It's like, no, I need to represent and show and care about myself and also not replicate these ideas of, you too must succeed, resist, and all this stuff. It's like, no, I want you to be happy and I want you to know yourself, know your Blackness. To my educational slash professional space, I think that, to be honest, in the spaces that I occupy, my existence is really enough. And I think that where I am at professionally at this point is that it's not, and I wish I could say that I'm working with the kids that don't have, access. They have access in some of the most extreme ways. And so what do I bring into that space? I think I bring cognitive dissonance. I think I bring opportunities for reflection and thought. Where me being a whole person does matter and me learning boundaries about what work I will and will not do is important so that they at least have an interaction with someone who looks like me, who knows how to say no and who has boundaries and is willing to have those communications. And in terms of like the different curriculum that we create for schools domestically and abroad, I always care about platform and speech. Obviously, speech and debate. It's kind of in the phrase, right? Is that I want young people to be open to critical interrogation and willing to explore their thoughts, and then to also know and believe that there are adults and folks in their communities that will listen or at least will explore those thoughts with them. Because I think oftentimes what holds people back from self-development, transformation, and then I guess in this world of not participating in making the double consciousness harder for Black people is that they don't feel as though they can ask questions, engage. I work with a lot of not Black students, if people are kind of picking up what I'm putting down here, right? But that, okay, let's have the conversation. What's going on? Like, how do we talk about not just anti-Blackness directly, but like anti-Blackness is in everything. It's in how we talk about politics, it's in how we talk about economics, it's how we talk about just like speaking and creating one's own boundaries for themselves, even as a non-Black person. And so I really do think that my existence is enough. And so long as I keep myself whole to exist, that is what I'm trying to prioritize more of than burning myself out to try to overextend and be everything to everyone, because we come from generations of that, and I'm not going to fully stop that. I care. Work is, I care about kids. I care about young people. It's kind of why I've stayed in the space for the amount of time that I have. But I also care about me a whole bunch too, and starting to center more of that so that I can show up in better and more integrated ways that, you lead by how you live. And so I think that's where I'm at this point with the work that I do specifically in the spaces that I occupy, which I'm hoping start to diversify up a little bit more as I, continue doing all these different life quests.
Man, I'm my sister, I'm gonna call you my sister now, just said my existence is enough. And like of all the things like that really hit with me. And I think like that is the way that we, particularly Black educators, that's the way in which we prepare the next generation to also exist in this space, is to realize that your existence is enough. You are enough by yourself. Like you don't have to put on some sort of like strenuous like activism that you wouldn't normally do just to convince us, that we exist. Like you being your full self in the space is enough. I'm thinking about Dr. Chris Emden, I think, in what's the book called? For White Folks Teaching the Hood, and the rest of y'all too. There's a whole chapter about like being fly or being clean or whatever it is. There's an artist, Jadena, one line in his song, he says, I don't want my best dressed day to be in a casket. And like, I had a kid tell me, he was like, it's like, Mr. Brown, you got like 20 suits. I was like, no, I don't have 20 suits, but I'm gonna be clean every time I come to work, because that's my full self. Like that's who I am. And like, whether it's the music I listen to, how I dress, how I speak, how I show up, like choosing to be my full self is enough. And it is enough to teach other young Black people, like, you can be your full self in a space. And if I teach you nothing else, if you don't remember every lesson in every classroom, every homework assignment, but if you remember that it is okay for you to show up as your full self each and every day, then I've taught you something extremely valuable that's going to help you throughout the rest of your life. And I had a leader tell me, wasn't a leader of color, tell me, like, you need to be seen leading. And I've said that before to other, like, emerging educators and leaders, like, you need to be seen leading and doing the things. But I also want to say, like, you need to be seen living, right? You need to be seen living out your full self, whatever that's the music or clothes, like, if you're me, or whether that's the way you speak or what you read or what you watch on TV, and being free enough to express what that is and not hide it, right? Be seen living out loud, because that is a thing that we learn through observation, right? And that's the thing that we observe and see, like, oh, this person doesn't mind being their full self, then I could be my full self. They don't mind, like, being Black and wearing these clothes and eating this food and saying these things and using this slang, then maybe I shouldn't mind either, and it's okay, right? There's a place I can go in, like, I can be that too. And I think the large takeaway that I want people to have is that no matter what we experience, like, this idea of double consciousness is not like a fixed state of being that we have to have this double consciousness all the time, everywhere. Like, we can actually choose to be ourselves. And that is always revolutionary, right? Choosing to be your full self in a world in which society is saying your full self doesn't have value, or it doesn't matter, or it's not worth anything. But we can actually choose to be that and see that it does have value, and there are people who look like you, and also, quite as it kept, people who don't look like you that need to see it. They need to see it and learn from it, right? And so, like, we rob the world, we rob the universe of a lot of brilliance when we choose to dial it back. And that's something that took me years to learn, but, like, we literally are robbing society in the future and whatever we want to build or create when we choose to put ourselves into these boxes, because that's what we can capitalize on and monetize, right? So my advice and what I give to myself and everyone else is, like, be your full self and be that out loud all the time and make the world adjust to you.
Thank you for sharing that. I know we're about to close out, but I think you touched right on the last question we asked in the episode of, like, what would it look like to show up whole? And I think you're starting to name this, right? Like, that is the meaning making. That is the defining, is to show up as your whole self, right? And I think I'm gonna pass the mic back to Larry, but I just really hope that the audience watching, etc., your takeaway is, like, you have a responsibility to your community, to your lineage, to show up whole, to define for yourself what it means to exist, and not juxtapose anything but what is within you, because it's already within you.
Yeah, thank you for lifting that, Nell. Thank you, Dr. Brown, and thank you, Jasmine, for being with us. This was a great conversation. As we close out, yeah, come on for the claps.
Clap it up.
As we close out, I just want to bring us back to the text that grounded our conversation by W.E.B. Du Bois and his concept of two souls. We know that that idea names the wound that, all Black people, brown people have to grapple with. But we also know that that concept also points towards this desire for wholeness, to be seen without distortion and to live without internal war. We know that double consciousness is that living reality that is shaped by our history, our institutions, and everyday interactions. And so the work, to everyone's point, that we've lifted today is to build spaces where Black and brown people are not merely included, but we are fully seen, fully heard, and fully received as human. I really want to thank everyone that tuned in to be on the episode conversation. If you have not watched episode 5 yet, go back and watch it. Search on YouTube, Education in Context, and then come back to this conversation, to this live talk back with the new lens. Also, please share this conversation with someone who needs this language, and continue to build spaces in your community where Black and brown people can show up as their whole self. If you would like to join the conversation, please drop a comment after the live by telling us or responding to the question, what does belonging without splitting yourself look like to you? And remember to like and subscribe to Education in Context on YouTube. If you'd like to learn more about our mission and vision, please go to educationincontext.org. Thank you.